Okay, test, test, test. First, we're going to check the audio. This mic here. Okay, testing, testing. That seems moderately okay. Now let's see if the stream is live. Looks like it is on Twitch. Check out YouTube. Chess Dojo on YouTube. Call it up. All right, looks live to me. So, hey everybody. This is just an opportunistic little stream here on a Friday afternoon in Hawaii, or midday. Basically, my kid just went down for a nap, so I'm going to try and do a very short stream covering the end of this round here in the Cairns Cup. There are two rook endgames for the two American players. Okay, I got it set up. Two different ones. Two American players. I'm not, a patriotic American. I care about players not from the U.S. as well. I just happen to like these two players. I just happen to be a fan of Alice Lee and Carissa Yip. Saw them both playing. This could be painful coverage from the perspective of anyone else out there who's a fan of theirs, because because they're both down a pawn. So, neither of them is going to win their game. And it could be, an hour of grim defense followed by a blunder and losing, or an hour of grim defense followed by losing anyway without a blunder just because your opponent plays well. But you have to fight these positions out to the end. But it's interesting to play these positions and to think about these positions, whether you win or lose. And chess is also interesting and fun, whether you win or lose. So it's an important part of chess to lose. We got to be okay with that. So hopefully that's not too big a hang up or a problem for those of you tuning in. And maybe you're fans of Tan Zhongyi or Maria Muzichuk, and then obviously you'd be fine seeing them maybe convert these endgames. Let's see how it goes. We've got action down here on the Muzichuk Yip game, so let's go to that. That might be the easiest one to figure out what's going on after this rook capture reduces the material. So I saw the position after a6, king to g7. The king goes into the corner, and by going into the corner, Carissa threatens to take this pawn. Now, I thought that Muzichuk was going to play a7 to keep the rook from taking the pawns. Do you see how a7 prevents the rook from taking the pawns? Maybe, hopefully. Some of you. So let's try taking the pawn and see what happens. White can move the rook somewhere. They can also play rook g8 check, but they don't have to. Just taking the pawns, just moving the rook's good enough. You come back, and then queens. Okay, and also pretty good is this move. Rook check, king here. I guess in this case it's even better by accident. Chess.com's just not allowing arrows today, because you attack the king and the rook. Well, anyway, I'm gonna have to do this all without arrows since they're not allowed on chess.com today. If I refresh you, chess.com, might you allow? No. Nope. Sweet. Okay, so h3. So basically a7 prevents rook takes g2. So I expected a7. Instead, we get h3. So Carissa is able to take a pawn. Black plays rook, and white plays rook d8. That's the point. Threatening a7, a8. Very clever move from Maria Muzic. Like, now I understand why she played h3. And then if the rook comes here, well, the rook has to come here, right? Any move other than rook a2, pretty much white can play a7 and then a8 queen, right? Hey, Nordvik. So rook d8. The rook has to come to a2 to prevent the move a7. That's the only move that stops a7. You can throw in rook d2 check, but it doesn't change the fact that you have to go rook a2 next move. White's able to play rook takes d6 and to get the rook to a more active space instead of a8, defending the pawn like this. But also, very importantly, what do I mean by active? The rook's got more different things it can do from here than from a8, where it would be stuck. Man, it's really annoying that they've got arrows turned off on chess.com today. Okay. Occasionally, an arrow will work. A rook on a8 has limited things it can do. The big advantage of a rook on d6 is that if you bring your king to b6, please. What is going on? Okay, basically, okay. If you bring your king to b7, I'm sorry, I can't even show squares today, folks. If you bring your king to b7, then if your opponent plays rook b2 check, you can always play rook to b6, right? So basically, the rook here is able to provide shelter for the king, bridge it against checks from behind. So it looks very dangerous for black to plan of bringing the king to b7 here. Now, we do have one comment in the chat saying that black should just draw. Someone else saying that it looks like an easy win for white. So that suggests that either it's more complicated than the players, than the people watching think, or I don't know where the confidence comes from. So let me have a look myself and see what's going on. So white wants to play king c5, king b6, king c7, king b7, etc. If black tries to stop it with something like rook c2 to keep the king at bay, then you could always play a7. Rook back to a2 would be forced. Rook d7, and then the same plan of bringing the king to b8. So normally, to my eyes, the only plan we could use for black that could possibly save this would be bringing the king to the queen side. I don't see how just the rook can defend against king and rook over here. On the other hand, if we just start walking across, then it's going to give white the chance to eat the h6 pawn. So I feel like we might need to play h5, right? And then start bringing the king. Now they can do this. I'm putting up some kind of a defense for a moment. Have I played any of the players in this tournament? I don't think I've played any of them in a tournament. I have practiced with Carissa outside of tournaments. So if played means have you ever played chess with anyone here? I've played chess with Carissa. If it means have I ever played any of them in a tournament, then no. I've not played Harika, I've not played Maria, I've not played Alina, I've not played Nino, Tan, Humpy, Bibisara, Alice, none of them. So this position, I'm still putting up a little defense for black. I bring the king closer. Come here, preparing to answer a7 with rook a7. Rook here. Okay, feels like I still lost. I could try and play this defense better than I did, but I can conceive of one other possible way to defend such a position, which would be to snag the h-pawn, come back, sack the rook for the a-pawn, and then try and draw king and pawn against rook. I think that's the second conceptual way you could try to defend as black. Does that make sense? The rook cannot stop the king from coming here and getting defended by its rook. So you have two different methods to try and save this game. One is you bring your king, and maybe your king and rook together can defend against their king and rook. My first attempt at that didn't work. The second schematic thing we could do is we could try and go after this pawn, capture it, come back here. White can't queen the pawn without bringing the king there. Then we sack our rook for that pawn once their king's far away from this pawn, and then advance. However, if our king is cut off like this, I think the h-pawn loses to the rook, no matter how far away white's king is. Because your king can't come up the board with it. Eventually your pawn gets like h4 or something. They attack you with rook a4. You play h3, and then they play rook h4 winning. So for this to possibly draw to take this pawn and come back, we would also need to be able to release our king from this trap. Right? But it seems very hard to cross our king. But okay, that's just the conceptual picture. Then we could do a little calculation and see what's happening. I think a move has already been played, by the way. It was h5. King c5 played very quickly by white. Now black could still go after this pawn or start bringing the king over. h5 didn't 100% commit. But we've already tried king f7, so we're going to try this now in analysis ourselves here. So here white's even threatening rook a6 queening. And as I mentioned before, this endgame here is lost. Your king can't cross the rook to get close enough to the pawn, so the pawn goes. And honestly, they can even wait another turn, you see? This is like lost by 2 files. The position would be lost even with the rook here and the king here, for those who want to just... For those at a higher level who want to memorize some endgame theory. But I'm showing you why, I'm not just telling you. So we could play king b6. The king can't get any closer to the pawn. When it goes to the 3rd rank, you can always attack it. If the king were as far as the 5th rank, it could always defend the pawn. But if the king's on the 6th or the 7th rank or the 8th rank, this move here will just catch the pawn in time. If the black king was not cut off, bold cool. Like, let's say in this position, the black king could move through g6, right? And then white played like king b6, and black played king g5. Or maybe f5 would be slightly better, right? And then king c5, and then h4. King d4, h3, king e3. White would still win. Black doesn't quite have enough time to draw here, even with the king not cut off. In this case, with the king cut off, there's sort of nothing to think about. So my sense is this endgame is winning for Maria at this point. King f7 tried by Carissa. So I've given you my breakdown and eval for this position below me for the moment. Now we're going to try and have a look at the other one, okay? So let's go look over here. Tan Zhongyi against Alice Lee. We picked up the game around this point here. Rook b3 had just been played. Here, Alice thought for a long time and then went quote-unquote active with the rook. If black never moves the pawn dealt, white will eventually bring the king over and capture it too. So the idea is the rook can get behind this pawn, check this king, etc. This looks possibly savable for black. Did I open up my human eval window? It's like not yet. I don't know if we need it. Is it easier for Alice to draw because pawns are on the same side? Sure. That means this pawn's much closer to her king, right? Versus the A pawn on the other board. That probably helps quite a bit. So I guess her chances of drawing seem more promising here than on the other board. Gets checked. Rook b8, check here. Check. With the idea of king takes, rook f4. Aggressive. And if king g4, maybe she's planning rook f2. You see? So she's trying to, Alice is trying to trade the last pawn, the h pawn for one of these two pawns. That would be a theoretical draw. That is, I mean, I think Bold Cool, that was a very good question. Bold Cool asked, is it easier for Alice to draw because the pawns are all on the same side? It means if at any point she trades this pawn for this pawn, it'll be a draw because her king is in position to deal with the last pawn. If she trades these two pawns, it'll always be a draw because her king's in position to catch this pawn. Whereas when you look on the other board, if you traded these two pawns, it looks like black would still lose. So yeah, we definitely see how it stretches the defensive capabilities of the king to have the pawns on separate sides of the board. King h3 played, and Alice thinking here. So rook h1 check, king g4 doesn't really help her. I think the main moves she might consider would be something like rook f4, rook e1, king g5. Kind of attacking this e pawn makes sense here, I would say. She forces the draw on king h3, claims chess gone mad. Okay. Hey, Lumbra. My instinct is actually rook e1, not rook f4, for whatever it's worth. My instinct is rook e1, going after this pawn. King g5 is plausible too, because it threatens checkmate. So those are like my two main ideas are going to be these two probably. Let's look at rook e1 first. Rook e1. Rook f4 was just played, by the way. So a third move compared to what Chess Gone Mad and I were talking about. Rook here, we attack this pawn. Okay. If white plays check, then they could go for rook to g4, right? Saving the game. So I'm going to come here, the only move that stops rook g4. And when I say saving the game, I mean winning the game, right? But do you see this setup for white? This feels like a winning setup, except for mate in 1. Oops. There's a little problem with that maneuver. Okay, maybe black can go anywhere. I'm going to go back to rook e8, defending the pawn, and now I would play king g5. So the point is, my rook's eyeing this pawn. Whether it goes to e5 or e6, I'm always still attacking it, and it's not really threatening to queen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the white king back with rook e3 check, king here, that protects this pawn. And then I'm going to go after that pawn with the king. So let's have a quick look how that plays out. And white wins because the king's in front of the pawn. So that strategy did not work. Okay, so that setup, at first glance, not so obvious how it should work. Here's another way we could try to defend this. Oh, that's a good suggestion, Chess Gone Mad. I was going to show a different suggestion. We come here. Just saying that the king can't really get out and that our king just keeps this pawn embraced. We don't rush to take it. We just keep it controlled so it can never queen, right? What's white's plan here? King here. Then we can just play h3. King here, we take. Done. Yeah, there's just nothing for white to do if we just keep our king next to the pawn. Very simple. Chess Gone Mad had a trickier solution that probably has already works, which is h3. The plan is if takes, then he can take, and it's a draw because it's an h pawn. You would have to also calculate g3 before going for this. And what would be the plan then? Rook e6 is still lost, by the way, for those who are not experts in rook and pawn endings. This king only needs to reach h4 for this endgame to be winning for white. So So after G3, maybe we've burned our energy with H3. I'm not sure if Chess Gone Mad calculated some clever moves that I didn't notice just yet. But this looks risky for black. Instead, I think we've got a very, very instructive and clean strategy for drawing this endgame. You just keep your king next to that e-pawn, but you don't take it. And your rook holds the white king from making any progress. I don't see anything for white to do here. This looks like a very clean draw for black, right? If the rook moves anywhere, you can take the pawn, pretty much. I mean, we have to be, like, mildly careful. Right? So, play something like king f8. Attack the rook. Again, just keeping the pawn controlled instead of capturing it works once again. So that's a clean drawing approach for Alice. I haven't double-checked it, but I would say I'm immediately 90+% confident that this move holds the draw. Next, let's look at the move she played. Rook f4. Rook e8, king f7. So the concept is to chase this rook off of defending this pawn by playing king f6. The danger is rook e5, king f6, rook f5 check looks winning for white. Rook e5 played, and she plays king g6. So she's just, her defense is not 100% like forcing moves. It's to then say, okay, here you can't make progress. If rook f5, rook e4. If rook to one of these squares, you know, king back to f7 or f6. And if king goes backwards, of course, you're not making progress. And in fact, on king h2, black then could play king f6. And that's a draw. You just keep chasing this rook. You know, rook e8, king f7, rook e5, king f6. And ultimately, this is no longer winning because you don't have king h4 for white. Draw. Okay, so it still looks like Alice cleanly holds the draw here with her approach after king g6. I don't see an approach for white here that would upset things. Let's check the other game. Muzychuk's game is finished as we predicted in a win for Muzychuk. But let's look at the remaining moves, see if they match what we expected. Sorry, my computer is just dying for whatever reason today. So we were here at king f7, king b6, check, king here, rook b6, rook a2, king b7, and here she resigned. Yeah, we saw the same position in analysis a few moves before. So that was clean and clear. Now I'm going to add an eval bar maybe to the remaining game if my computer complies. Let's just try. Whoa. Crazy. What's really bad is that my computer's not working at all. That's rough. How's that? Can we see that okay? Yeah, it looks okay to me. Sorry. All right. So I'm putting a tiny plus for white, even though it's a draw. Just to indicate that, white's got the extra pawn, and if somebody won, it would be white. And if black blundered, there are ways for white to win. So it's still just, minutely worrisome for black to play. But I think Alice is going to hold it just fine. I truly think it is a clear draw at this point that she has calculated for sure. Alice is off to a really good start in this tournament. She had 2.5 out of 3 going into this game. So after this game, she'll have 2 wins and 2 draws. Playing against people 50 to 100 points higher rated than her. So, or I guess Tan is even more. Tan is a really, really top player, maybe number 4 among women in the world. Not off to a good start, though. She lost 1 game and hasn't won a game yet. Has a couple draws. So, yeah, not a powerful start for Tan Zhongyi so far. I think that the number 3 player is Lei and the number 4 is Tan, but I don't watch a lot of women's chess tournaments, so I'm going to go double check that for you all. Oh, actually, because of her loss earlier in this tournament, Tan has dropped behind Konero and Muzachuk. But before the tournament, I was correct. She was number 4 behind Lei Tingjie. Okay, so the rating that it's displaying for you right here, the rating that you see here of 2546, that was the 4th highest rating among active female tournament players. But I guess they're quite close up there, other than Ho Yifan, who's like a bunch of points ahead of the others, but is also barely active. So it's a pretty close group in places like 3 through 10. Okay, we get a move, rook check, king f7, attacking it again, rook over here. Well, that is no problem. You can take this pawn off. Rook takes h4. Now the king and pawn ending's lost, so Alice just needs to retreat her rook anywhere. I would expect her to put it somewhere like here. But I predict that wrong. She gives a check. Just to get a tempo to put her king on the simplest square. And then the Philidor position is basically going to bring this rook over here with the king on g7. And then nothing interesting left to happen on that board. So, yeah, that cleared up. We did manage to figure out both of those 2 rook endings, in my opinion. And that's going to be close to the end of this little mini stream, right? These games are pretty close to decided now. King g4, king g6. Checks the king back. They're playing quite quickly because they both know the result by this point. Okay, hang on. Updating the fight commands here. They seem to be playing out a lot of moves here. Oh, against a g-pawn, by the way, you don't even need to do Philidor's position, folks. You can literally, against a g-pawn, put your king on g8, rook on a8, and just sit. It's called passive defense. Normally, it's better to have your pieces active, and it's better to have your pieces active in the endgame, or in any part of the game, as some of you may know. But famously, against g and h pawns with rooks on the board, you can play the passive defense. All right, so these should be the links for Friday night fights for tonight. Should be accurate there over on Twitch. Dangus Khan, welcome to the dojo and the stream. Happy to hear that you had a crazy game last night and that you enjoyed it. I think that when this game ends, I'm just going to go back to housework since my kid will probably be up from the nap pretty soon. So I'll check out your game another time. While we're here, an announcement about the Friday night fight. So I'm in a new time zone, so I have to change when I do commentary. My current thought is to leave the tournament at the normal time, but start my commentary 3 hours later when I'm able to here in my new time zone. So that's what we're going to try today, and we'll see how it works, and if we have to change things for next week or the week after. You know, we'll experiment until we find something that works for me and for our players. Okay, the draw is agreed. Rooks move back and forth. Well defended by Alice Lee, that whole rook endgame. I guess the most instructive... I guess we've got a couple really instructive moments from these rook endings. So let's quickly state what they were. Okay. So for this one that ended in a draw, the instructive maneuver to me is black going active with the rook like this. Right? And then this sequence with pushing the H-pawn. Counterattacking the E-pawn, right? And sort of forcing the white king back with that H-pawn and the rook. And that allowed black to keep white from making any progress. To make progress, white made a pawn trade, and then the king is well within range of the G-pawn to hold the draw. If we look at our other board, the key instructive move was perhaps a winning maneuver from Maria Muzichuk. I didn't see a defense to it. It was in this position here, playing H3 instead of A7, leaving her pawn on A6, where there's a nice shelter for the king to run to, and correctly calculating that against rook G2, she could play rook D8 to D6, defending her pawn with a much better actively placed rook on the side. The rook not only is able to provide a bridge for the king to shelter from checks when it comes to help the pawn, as we mentioned immediately, but a secondary role of that rook is it keeps the black king from advancing and getting counterplay with the H-pawn. So this seemed to be a winning position, and so very nice maneuver here from Maria with H3 and then rook D8. So sad for Carissa. But hopefully there was something earlier in the game for her to learn from, if not in the endgame phase. And that's going to be it for these games here, for everything we have to say about these games. Yeah. I guess related announcement, one of the reasons that I'm looking at the Cairns Cup right now is that I was thinking of maybe doing some coverage of it next week. I believe my kids are going to start doing a couple hours of summer school, just from 10 to noon here, which is 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Pacific. And I was thinking I might be able to catch 2 hours of these Cairns Cup games each day and do a little spot of commentary on them. So we'll see if that pans out, but that's what I'm looking to do. I was happy to see good starts to the tournament for Carissa and Alice, who I'm both fans of. And so hopefully next week there will be some fun and exciting games. I also had the sense that there was a pretty good number of decisive results, and the tournament just looked interesting to me for whatever reason, as we'll get into more next week if I do have the opportunity to continue coverage. So thanks, folks, for checking in. I'll be back on tonight for Friday night fights, but when I say tonight, I mean late in the night, because I'm in Hawaii time zone now. That means when I come on, it'll already be 2 a.m. Eastern for those in the U.S., but I imagine there will be a different crew watching then. and it will be probably be some people in Asia, Africa, and Europe who will be on for Friday Night Fights. In any case, as always, give you all my love and respect and well wishes, and send you off on a little raid to the St. Louis Chess Club that might have interviews. St. Louis Chess Club hosts the Cairns Cup, so they might have some little interviews coming up with Alice Lee or some other of the players from the Cairns Cup. And yeah, all my best, everybody. Take care.